Hello and welcome to this tactical analysis of the Leeds versus Wolverhampton Wanderers game. If you're enjoying this video or any content that we make on this channel, please don't forget to smash the like button. With that, onto the tactical analysis. So I think it's important to start off talking about Leeds' selection. They do have quite a thin squad. They were forced to playing a number of youth products this game, and I think that does affect how efficient your style of play is. So for example, you've got Koch and Ayling as well as Bamford out. Obviously Bamford is really important for their pressing, and then Ayling as well I think is really good in being able to try and support that right hand side of the attack when Leeds are in possession. And as the likes of Jurgen Klopp has said, all it takes is 1-2%, and that is enough for you to not be able to get the points. Whilst I have said all of that, I do think that Shackleton, Gerhardt and Somerville did really do well for themselves. To try and keep these videos short, I'm putting my summary notes in the comments down below as well as in the description, so please have a look. If you think I missed something, it might have been covered in there. With that, let's talk about Leeds' build-up. So Leeds typically set up in a 2-3 deep and then moved into a 4-1-4-1 shape. And then later in the game, they had a little bit more of a 2-3-4-1 with the fullbacks being a little bit more aggressive, at least in the initial part, to try and avoid Wolverhampton being able to press. Although Wolverhampton weren't really looking to try and press short goal kicks, Meslier did try and throw the ball out and get the ball out to his defenders as quick as possible when the ball had gone dead. Okay, so this is a good example of Leeds trying to build up out of the back. You've got Shackleton, the right back, trying to pass it into Rodrigo, who's pulled out to more of a right midfield position, with Rafinha tucking into more of a cam position. You actually have Click dropping deep, as I said, to try and relieve a little bit of that pressure. And then with regards to Wolverhampton Wanderers, they've got their 5-4-1 shape. So you've got Hwang, the left wide forward, trying to cover the passing lane into the forwards of Leeds. And then you have the centre midfielders of Wolverhampton Wanderers putting a little bit of pressure on the Leeds centre midfielders, just preventing them from being able to pick up their heads and be able to pass forwards and break the lines. And then the next part of the defensive jigsaw for Wolverhampton Wanderers was their fullbacks, who would be really quick to try and press towards the wide players for Leeds. And here you've got Rodrigo, who's being forced deeper by just how congested it was in this space. And then he's going to try and fire a long ball for Dan James, who's trying to run him behind the back line of Wolves. This being the next stage of that play, was the centre-backs were able to win that high ball and they header it back. And then Click wins the second ball here and he passes it back to Rodrigo. Rodrigo wants to try and take advantage of the space that's now been created by Ait Nouri, the wing-back for Wolverhampton, who's gone to go and press towards Click. And you can see that Leeds were set up to try and do this by the movement of both Shackleton, their right-back, but then also with Rafinha as well, who are both looking to try and get into this space. And this being kind of the final phase of the play, I think it was important to show just how aggressive the fullbacks of Leeds could end up being. So here we have both Dallas and Shackleton really high up the pitch. And of course you have the fundamental shape of Wolverhampton Wanderers in their 5-4-1 with both of their wing backs deep, tracking the runs of their fullbacks. Of course, this is Wolverhampton Wanderers, so they were really disciplined and constantly covering across, as we mentioned, narrowing the spaces in the wide channels. Leeds would try and switch, but when Leeds were trying to play in those wide spaces, there was constant rotation by their forwards. So we can see here with Moutinho trying to press towards Llorente, who was really important, I think, for Leeds because of both how calm he was, but then also his range of passing. Whilst you also have Hwang, who's trying to press towards the fullback of Leeds. Earlier on in the game, actually, the wing backs of Wolverhampton Wanderers were really important at trying to close down the space for whoever the wide player was, whether that was Rafinha or Harrison, the one midfielders, or the fullbacks for Leeds. Of course, as the game develops, the wing backs tire and they're not able to press with that same intensity. Regardless, Wolverhampton trying to press towards the fullback, as we mentioned earlier, and trying to press them towards the touchline. This allows the likes of Click to be able to try and take advantage of the space created by the running of the wide midfielders of Leeds, such as Somerville, who'd just made a run in behind, which drags away Ait Nouri. Also, making those runs by the Leeds forward lines were probably a thankless task. I do think it was important because it draws away the Wolverhampton defence and just creates a little bit more space for the likes of Click or Rodrigo or Roberts to be able to work in. And it also allows the likes of Dallas, who was typically a deep runner from left back, to be able to also gallop into those spaces. And then because of how far the Wolves backline have dropped, it makes it really difficult for them to be able to then push up, and it creates a head of steam for the Leeds' attack. So this is further on in the play. We've got Moutinho again trying to press towards Llorente, prevent him from being able to pick up his head and pick out a pass. Of course, with Moutinho stepping out, that does leave space for the likes of Roberts as well as Somerville to try and exploit. Okay, so moving on to Wolverhampton Wanderers 5-4-1 press. The centre midfielders and centre forward try and prevent easy passes into straight, and the midfield as a whole try and congest the spaces in the wide areas to try and prevent the Leeds fullbacks from being able to pass through the lines and then break beyond the midfield of Wolves and into attacking positions. So in this scenario, Wolverhampton have been able to successfully deny space on the left-hand side. Leeds are trying to circulate the ball towards their left-hand side, Wolverhampton's right-hand side now, with Jimenez initially preventing easy passes into strike. Then as soon as Leeds pass it into Dallas, the left-back, then we'll see that as a trigger and they press immediately with a lot of intensity, forcing Leeds into pass backs and then eventually into a long ball. Later in the game, Leeds moved to a 2-3-4-1. They've got more onus on them Obviously this is at home, but then also they're behind. Obviously a key change by this point in the game is the fact that Rafinha's gone off. I think he's injured. Hopefully he comes back soon. In the 2-3-4-1, there's a lot of onus on Roberts and Rodrigo to play as 8s. They're really important for progressing the ball from deep, and then also for finishing the moves. Earlier in the game, James was playing as centre forward, but he doesn't really provide an aerial threat, and he wasn't really dribbling. He was more just a threat in behind, and that was it. Earlier in the game, when he would come out into the wide spaces, he would offer briefly, but then immediately run in behind. And on occasion, Dallas would point out to him that actually we don't want you to always run in behind. Sometimes show for the ball so that then I can pass it into you and use you as a back ball, so that then I can get beyond the midfield line of Wolverhampton. Having both Rodrigo and Roberts on the pitch did solve a little bit the aerial dilemma that they had earlier on in the game, where Rodrigo is really the only aerial, but then he's playing as a number 8 and constantly floating out into wide spaces, and then sometimes crossing it in for basically nobody. At this point, instead you have Roberts and Rodrigo, so yes, whilst they dropped or they did pull wide, one of them would typically be in the box to be able to try and compete for the cross. I say that also Gerhardt brought something special to the table. So whilst Gerhardt wasn't going to be aerially dominant, again, relatively diminutive, but he was really confident in his dribbling skills and constantly drove at the Wolverhampton defenders, and he did so with aplomb. Okay, so in this example, we have the 2-3-4-1. We've got Roberts, who's meant to be one of your centre midfielders by this point, dropping really deep to try and help progression. You've got Rodrigo as well as also Gerhardt as your centre forwards, whilst in your wide midfield position, you've got Dan James trying to take advantage of the fact that the wing back for Wolverhampton Wanderers is trying to be aggressive. I should point out here that Dallas has swapped with Roberts. Whilst Roberts dropped deep, then Dallas pushed a little bit higher up, so that then whilst Roberts drawn players away, then Dallas has then taken advantage of the space that's left. Funnily enough, in this example as well, Dan James is going long rather than coming short, so then the Wolves wing back is able to win the ball, but Dallas then collapses in on him. And I think it's good to highlight here just how aggressive Semedo has been. Just as we mentioned earlier, the Wolverhampton Wanderers wing backs were quite aggressive at times, trying to be positive when they could. So we see that here with Semedo's aggressive position, at least initially before the ball was lost. This then does potentially expose your wide centre back in Saiz and Kilman. And you have here Gerhardt doing what Dan James was expected to do on occasion earlier in the game, where he's dropping instead of immediately trying to run in behind. And instead you then have the third man runner in Rodrigo trying to then make that run. And then lastly, just to mention the fact that you've got Shackleton, the right back, he's trying to also support the direct play of Leeds, and he's trying to get up as well. Okay, so this is a game between Leeds and Wolverhampton, so of course counter-attacks were really important. The fact that both teams were constantly trying to counter-attack did make sections of the game very, very frenetic, and passes became quite poor or intercepted. On occasion, the focus on trying to run beyond the Wolverhampton back line did make it very difficult for the Leeds United ball carrier, just because it put a lot of onus on them to make good decisions and also be really good at dribbling. Okay, so on to Wolverhampton Wanderers' deep build-up. So typically they're built up in a 3-4-3, a 2-5-3, or a 2-3-2-3. The 2-3-2-3 was typically used later on in the game, but was also used when Wolverhampton had deep free kicks in their own half, and they would use that as a means to get their wing backs higher up the pitch and be in position to compete for second balls, potentially counter press or running behind. Throughout most of the game, Wolverhampton demonstrated their conservative side with long goal kicks. When they did pass short, it was a little bit sketchy, although on that I would say that that might just be recency bias on my side, because I think their short pass in the 79th minute or so, the last 10 minutes of the game, was really dodgy. So in the 3-4-3 or the 2-5-3 used earlier in the game, they're trying the long balls into Jimenez. Typically, he's going to be the focal point, and he will have pulled over to whichever side the goalkeeper or the centre-back is playing the long ball into. And then you're going to have the other two forwards trying to run in behind. Later in the game, when they use the 2-3-2-3, as well as with those free kicks that we mentioned too, they try to have the wing-backs higher up, and then you'd have the wide forward on the side that the ball was being played to drop. This pulls a Leeds fullback higher up the pitch towards Wolves' side, and then that creates space in behind for the Wolverhampton wing-back to be able to try and exploit. On that, a little bit of positive determinism with Shackleton almost being shackled to Hwang, constantly tracking him as he floated all over the pitch at times. That's important to mention just because of the effect it then had on Rafinha and later Somerville, because they would then have to try and cover and just not allow there to be this huge gaping hole at right back. So in this scenario, we see Llorente, who's going to try and win the long ball from the Wolverhampton goalkeeper. This was a pattern throughout the game. He was constantly contesting these long balls with Jimenez, and often he came out ahead, literally. And you were getting the same hounding by the other defenders in the Leeds backline as well. So whenever the wide forwards for Wolverhampton tried to drop, the Leeds defender that was tasked with defending against them would track them and would prevent them from being able to turn and get any sort of header steamer. So here we have our 3-4-3 or 3-2-2-3, with that second two being your wing backs. You've got Gerhardt putting pressure on Saiss while Shackleton is tracking Hwang. As mentioned earlier, Hwang has dropped deeper to try and create space in behind, caused by the fact that Shackleton has tracked him. In this situation, Somerville, the wide midfielder for Leeds, has to track Ait Nouri, the wing back for Wolverhampton. This is another example of that, where we have our wing-backs for Wolverhampton relatively high, being tracked by their wide midfielders, and then you've got one of the Wolverhampton forwards trying to drop and receive the long ball, but he's being tracked, hounded by the Leeds defender. Okay, so Wolverhampton Wanderers in possession tried to play in a 3-2-5 shape. So you've got your back three, and then you've got your two sitting midfielders, and then you've got your wing-backs as your widest players, whilst your wide forwards tuck inside. The plan of Wolverhampton being that they hopefully take advantage of a lapse in concentration by the wide midfielders of Leeds, and also the space that's created by the fact that they have numerical advantage due to their formation in the wide spaces. So we see in this scenario where you have Hwang trying to run in behind, as well as also just off screen, Ait Nouri is also trying to exploit the space just in behind the Leeds defence. By coming more narrow, Hwang has drawn his marker, his tracker Shackleton, more narrow, and then that's what allows Saiss to try and play this ball in for Ait Nouri. So this is the next phase of that play. We've got Shackleton coming out wide because Hwang's out here as well, and that creates obviously an absolute chasm between himself and his partner in Llorente. Another avenue for springing Wolverhampton attacks were their throw-ins. So they were set up in their 3-4-3 shape. You've got your wing back throwing it in, but then you'd have your centre forward and your near-sided wide forward dropping a little bit deeper. Wolverhampton wanted their near-sided forward and centre forward to combine, such that they could take advantage of the fact that their far-sided forward had come more narrow into almost a counter-attacking position, so that if they were able to take advantage of the fact that Leeds really narrow the pitch off Wolverhampton throw-ins, then they'd be able to play the ball in behind. And then finally, with regards to Wolverhampton's counters, part of the challenges faced by Wolverhampton when they tried to counter were that the Leeds defenders were really dogged in their task in just preventing the Wolverhampton forward from being able to turn and face them up and then be able to drive forwards. This really reduced the momentum of Wolverhampton's counters, and if the Leeds players weren't able to stop the counter legally, they sometimes went for the more illegal foul route too. Another obstacle was Meslier, and he was really quick off his line, so even though you had the likes of Traore, who was always happy to try and run in behind, Meslier was really quick to get to the ball. Wolverhampton were really looking to try and counter from Leeds' corners. So when Leeds had a corner, Wolverhampton would often leave two up, allowing them to be able to hit either channel with a lot of pace. This also has a knock-on effect, and it also reduces the potency of Leeds' corners because they have to leave another player back. And with that, we're out.